A little off-putting, I know. I can't even see the screen. But when you're going to talk about fears, how else should you appear? I'd love to do the whole thing with these, but I can't see the computer, I can't see the keyboard, can't see the timer, can't see my hands, I can't see anything. Why put up any videos at all? This one is going to be about fears. A delightful subject, right? Oh man, I gotta see something here. Alright, what's the point of talking about fears? There's an assumption behind this discussion that if you really, really, really want to know about the historical Jewish Jesus, if you want to discover anything, then you want to confront the fears that get in the way of knowing him. I always say a fundamental thing in any field, any scientific or scholarly field, it's not what do we know, what can we know. The real question, and especially for the historical Jesus, is do you want to know the historical Jewish Jesus? Because if you don't want to know, and most people don't want to know anything about him, especially in the scholarly world, then there's lots of things. There are a million ways to subvert genuine historical study if you don't want to know anything. And scholars, I think, have discovered them all, 1,000,001 ways. So I'm going to talk about fears here, even though I don't know anymore why I'm putting up any videos. Is anybody listening? Anybody paying attention? Putting up a video, a webcam video especially, it's kind of like putting yourself in a glass bottle, and then you toss this glass bottle out onto the vast ocean of the internet in the hopes that it'll land on shore someday, somewhere, sometime. Somebody will discover it. And even if it's a distant generation from now, long after I'm dead, maybe this bottle will land on shore somewhere and somebody will finally get it, When people are really ready to have a genuine study and discussion of the historical Jesus, then they'll be ready to look back on these fears. So that's what I thought of. I thought, who should I make this video for? I should make it for people in the future. People in some future generation who will want to know, so what was it like to live in a climate of fears about the historical Jesus, when nobody really wanted to know who he was, what he taught, how he ended up on a Roman cross. So, I'm hoping, so for any future generation that wants to know what it's like, the first thing I have to tell you is that we lived here, this is the early 21st century, I'm making this video in June of 2011, we lived in this perfect storm of fears, and I mean perfect. Everything conspired to make sure the historical Jesus would never be known, would never be properly studied, never revealed. And you can see that whether you look at atheists, whether you look at or secularists, or religious Christians, or Jews. Look, I'll start with atheists. I know atheists and secular, it's a hard word to say, secularists. I'm going to say atheists because it's easier to say. Atheists have this belief. Atheism is another form of religion. I don't really care whether people believe in God or not. What I care about is whether you pay attention to the evidence. And atheists have as many reasons probably as religious people for not paying attention to the evidence. Atheists do the same thing religious people do. They bring their a priori convictions to the Bible. And one of their main a priori convictions is that the Bible, the Gospels included, are mostly or mainly or all fiction, or mainly fiction. They don't have any evidence for that. Like scholars, their belief is we don't need no stinking evidence. We got a priori convictions. That's all we need. And that's what they do. They don't have any evidence for it. They don't have any proof. One of the things that atheists are fond of saying is we don't need to prove a negative. So we atheists claim, the historical Jesus probably never existed. He's a myth that was invented by this group that wanted to start a new religion. But he never really existed. And we don't have to prove he didn't exist, they claim. You have to prove he did exist. Well, afraid not. Doesn't work that way. I'm sorry. Any statement, positive or negative, if it's to be genuinely a scientific statement and not a statement of mysticism, has to be susceptible to evidentiary discussion and proof. Remember the ether? Remember the 19th century physicists believing in the ether? They believed that the ether was this medium through which light traveled, like energy traveling through a wave of water or sound traveling through the air. They all believed in the ether. Turned out the ether did not exist. And there was this famous experiment conducted by Michelson and Morley that proved the ether did not exist. They weren't trying to prove that. They actually believed the ether did exist. They were trying to measure its drift, its direction, and its velocity. They inadvertently, as far as they were concerned, proved the ether didn't exist. Big shock to them. Took a while to sink in for them and for other physicists as well, but finally people did accept gradually that the ether didn't exist. My point here is that the statement the ether did not exist is a negative statement, is a scientific statement. It's not a scientific statement because it happens to be true. It's a scientific statement because it is susceptible of proof one way or the other. You can actually perform an experiment that will prove the ether did not exist. Same thing with the historical Jesus. If the statement the historical Jesus did not exist is to be a genuine historical scientific statement, you have to muster evidence for it. You can't just sit back and say, well, we don't need no stinking evidence. It's not a valid approach. You can't do that. And that's what atheists do. So when they claim we don't need evidence to prove the statement the historical Jesus did not exist, they're indulging in mysticism. That statement is a mystical statement as far that they're putting forth as far as they're concerned. You do need evidence. The claim not to need evidence is falling back on mysticism. And by the way, one of the ways you'd prove it, for example, if you look at elements of the story of Judas, the story of Jewish leaders meeting with Jesus, the so-called trial, there really wasn't a trial. If you look at these stories individually, the story of Barabbas, none of these stories match the way a fictional story would be told. They all have very odd elements in it that add up to a very true story, as I demonstrate in my work. So they don't match the fictional elements. All right, so atheists have this a priori. So what are atheists afraid of? They're very afraid that anything will be discovered that will demonstrate there is genuine history here. They don't want any part of the Bible to be historical. They don't want it to be shown in any manner that the gospel authors might have been genuine historians. They want the gospel authors to be myth makers. And any evidence that upsets that point of view is what they're afraid of. Now, religious people have the same fear as religious Christians, that is, has the same fear as atheists, although they're obviously coming at it from a different angle. In their case, they have certain beliefs about Jesus. You can enumerate them, a bunch of ideas, and they're afraid that some of these ideas will be demonstrated to be myth, that the actual history was very different. Now, one thing that never occurs to anyone here, never occurs to anybody, is it possible that a genuine historical study might reveal some Christian beliefs, not all, but some Christian beliefs about Jesus to be perfectly valid historically? They're not myths at all. For example, and I can just tell you one of the results of my work, is that the death of Jesus as a sacrifice, as a sacrificial death, might have much more historical foundation to it than anybody realized. So you may have a part of Christian beliefs confirmed. On the other hand, I can also tell you that some Christian beliefs will not be confirmed, particularly the belief that Jesus had Jewish enemies that did him in, that he was surrounded by Jewish enemies, and it was Jewish enemies like Judas and Jewish leaders who are primarily responsible for his death. The pattern of evidence in the Gospels do not support that. So there's a belief that will fall. I think for some religious Christians, perhaps many, they want all their beliefs to be confirmed by history, or history can take a hike. So they wouldn't be happy with the situation where historical study will confirm some of their beliefs but not others. It's all or nothing with them. So if history confirms some of what they believe, fine, but they're not interested if it doesn't confirm everything. And if history in particular dethrones any of their beliefs, like the belief about Jewish enemies surrounding Jesus, then they're going to be very, very unhappy. And they're afraid of a historical study that will produce that belief, that will produce that result. They're also afraid here, I think, of a certain injustice. If it turns out that Christianity has been teaching anything untrue, then that be tantamount to a serious injustice that was maintained for a long time. And I think there is an answer for that. You can't blame any culture entirely for an injustice. You can't say Christianity created this injustice. It's particular people, particular Christian theologians, and particular Christian scholars, historical scholars, who promote this belief. The fault lies with them and not Christianity as a whole. As for Jews, Jews have a really complicated relationship to this subject, a lot of fears, and I'm going to get to that in part 2 as well as some conclusions. Hold on to your hats or your hood.